Hi, my name is Dan Macon. I'm the Livestock and Natural Resources Advisor with the University of California Cooperative Extension, covering Placer, Nevada, Sutter, and Yuba counties in the Sierra Foothills and Sacramento Valley. And today I'd like to talk a bit about the principles of targeted grazing and as it applies specifically to grazing for fuel load reduction. To give you some sense of where we're going today, I'm going to talk about the importance of setting and communicating goals, go over briefly the principles of managed grazing as they apply to this type of activity, cover a few practical considerations both for ranchers and for land managers, and talk about where grazing might be the best option for fuel load reduction, share a few before and after photographs of animal impacts on wildfire fuels, and then wrap up with some key takeaway messages to think about. I want you to remember that we're just scratching the surface here. This is a really complicated and complex subject, and there's much more detail that we could go into in a longer time. I think it's helpful to start with the fact that these are living biological systems. This is one of my favorite quotes from one of my favorite authors, and I think this really applies to targeted grazing as well, that we really have to pay attention to the details to make this an effective tool. I want to start with talking a little bit about landowner or land manager goals. Certainly we're talking about fuel load reduction or modifying the fuel profile in this talk, but there may be other goals as well. We may be wanting to manage invasive weeds or facilitate ecological restoration. We may want to protect or enhance aesthetic values of a particular landscape. Some landowners want to avoid the use of herbicides, and there may be others that you can think of too. In terms of communicating these goals, it's vitally important for the producer and for the land manager to talk together. There may be long-term versus short-term goals that may or may not be compatible. We may want to reduce fire danger this year, but we may also want to think about long-term reductions in invasive weeds. We need to think about whether this is a multi-year project or a single entry project, and remember that we can't fix a long-term problem in a single year. Finally, we want to manage the expectations. What will the project look like when we're done? Grazed landscapes may still burn, but if they're grazed appropriately, they'll likely burn at a much lower intensity. I think it's also important here to understand the difference between a fire break and a fuel break. A fire break may be taken down to bare soil, and that's certainly not what we're trying to do with livestock, and may in fact be detrimental to the health of the livestock. When we think about managed grazing, these are the 5 principles that we try to manage with in terms of managed intensive grazing. But a few of these are particularly important when it comes to targeted grazing or fuel load reduction. First, we definitely want to use the shortest graze period possible. This helps us maximize the amount of consumption that we gain, and it also means that we're moving over the landscape as quickly as possible. We want to maintain high stock density, which means we'll have a more uniform grazing pattern across the landscape. And then we want to use these large herd sizes, partly because it also facilitates more rapid project completion, but it also maximizes all of the impacts that we're trying to obtain from grazing. I think it's important to think a little bit about overgrazing and maybe give us a definition here. My definition is that overgrazing means we are grazing a particular plant before it has recovered from the previous grazing. Overgrazing is a function of time, not necessarily animal numbers. And so it can really occur in 2 ways. We can leave the animals in a particular place too long and get a second bite of a plant before it's recovered. Or we can come back too soon, meaning that the rest period is too short for that plant to recover. But from a fuels perspective, overgrazing may actually be desirable. We may want to severely impact those plants so that they don't regrow in a particular fire season or grazing season. But we also need to keep in mind that this type of grazing management could have consequences for animal well-being, and we need to accommodate that possibility as well. Timing really is everything when it comes to fuel reduction. Grazing for fuel reduction in our part of the world on our foothill annual rangelands needs to occur typically when the forage is declining both in palatability and nutrition. So we need to graze heavily at a time when the animals may not want to consume that vegetation. We can provide supplemental protein to help maintain consumption and provide for animal health, but we can also use those grazing management principles that I talked about earlier. Environmental factors may also impact our projects. For example, we might get a late unexpected rain, which will cause regrowth in some of the vegetation we're trying to manage. Finally, we need to think a little bit about initial treatment versus maintenance. Sometimes with really decadent brush stands or other heavy fuels, we may be better off doing a mechanical treatment or prescribed burn to get the initial treatment. Grazing then can maintain a lower fuel profile into the future. Now, there are some practical considerations for producers to think about here. One of the things that we really think about in terms of livestock husbandry is that we've got this relationship between nutrition and reproduction. Animals need to be on a rising plane of nutrition during the reproductive phase to maximize the number of offspring that they're going to produce. We also need to think about animal welfare in terms of shade and shelter and access to water, and then the logistics for unloading and getting water to the animals. Those are all considerations that a producer needs to think about. From the standpoint of a land manager, we need to think about grazing and prescribed fire being the only fuels treatments that actually remove fuel from the landscape. If we use herbicides or if we masticate, we are not removing that fuel. We're just putting it down in contact with the soil surface, or we're killing the growing fuels that may become fuel later on. Really, from this perspective, livestock can be cost effective where access or topography makes using equipment difficult or hazardous, where chemical treatment is not an option for a variety of reasons, and where we need to treat really large landscapes that would be cost prohibitive to use hand crews or equipment. When we think about grazing behavior and individual preferences, many times I get asked about whether I should use goats or sheep or cattle in a project. And many targeted grazing customers think that goats are the only option here. But it's really a more complicated story than that. First off, I think it's important to remember that sheep and goats are not created equal. All livestock have different but overlapping forage preferences. I find that there is as much variation between individuals within a species as there is between species. So for example, the sheep that I manage will eat brush, will eat blackberries, and will eat grass and broadleaf weeds. I've seen goats that would prefer grass over brush. So it really depends on what the animals have been exposed to and how they've been managed. There are some rules of thumb, and I think matching the animals to the vegetation type is a good place to start. The sheep don't read the books. You know, there are exceptions to this rule. I've seen cattle that are excellent browsers, and I've seen, as I said, goats that prefer grass. But as a rule, cattle are going to prefer a diet that's 80% grass and 20% broadleaf generally. Sheep have a little more varied diet in that they're kind of 50-50 grass versus broadleaf plants or brush. And then goats will prefer typically more brush to grass. We also need to manage the other impacts that come from livestock producing or livestock grazing, trampling and manure deposition in particular, and keep in mind that these impacts will vary by the species we're using as well. And then finally, the class of animal can be really important here too. Dry females, cows or ewes or does that are not lactating don't have as much nutritional demand as lactating females, so we can push them a bit harder. Feeder animals or stockers, basically growing young animals, may be an opportunity to do some fuel modification, but with these comes some behavioral challenges that may make them more difficult to manage. We may want to think about running pairs in a particular set of circumstances. And by pairs, I mean female animals that are still nursing young. And then finally, I think there's a place for using castrated male animals of all species because their nutritional demands are far less, and we can really push them onto marginal forages where we want to really impact the fuel profile. I want to share a few before and after photographs of our sheep just to give you some sense of what livestock can do in an annual rangeland setting. This is a star thistle patch that we managed in 2018. And this was taken on June 18th. And you can see that just 5 days later, they had pretty much devegetated the star thistle in that area. They'd taken the fuel from probably 3 feet high down to less than 6 inches high in just 5 days. Here's another picture, a different kind of thistle and forage type. This is Italian thistle and a lot of annual grasses, including some really tall annual wild oats. And in just 1 day, that's what these sheep did. So you can see there's quite a modification of that fuel profile there. I want to leave you with a couple of takeaways that I think bear further discussion as we think about using targeted grazing. One is that as with conventional operations, targeted grazing businesses have to consider the relationships between nutrition, reproduction, animal welfare, and logistics. Many times targeted grazing operations have lower reproductive rates in their livestock, meaning they have fewer lambs or goat kids to sell. And as a consequence, that's why many of these operations charge a fee for the work that they do. An understanding of grazing behavior and forage preferences is critical to matching livestock to landowner goals and fuel types. Having these discussions early on helps avoid unpleasant surprises. There are definitely trade-offs involved in focusing on vegetation management rather than livestock production goals. I talked about the challenge in terms of reproduction. There's also challenges involved in having animals grazing in a public setting that I think are important to consider. Targeted grazing requires a whole different set of producer skills. It goes beyond kind of the traditional set of animal husbandry and range management skills. And then lastly, it will change the fuel profile, but it will not eliminate fire from the landscape. It's going to slow a fire down, but it's not going to put a fire out, in other words. Finally, I want to leave you with some additional resources that you might consult on these topics. The Targeted Grazing Handbook in particular by Karen Launchbaugh is a really excellent resource for people who are interested in doing this as a business and for landowners and land managers who want to learn more about how it may suit their particular circumstances. Thank you very much for listening, and I hope this has been helpful.